I was fixing fence posts when my neighbor's kid rode his bike down my gravel drive, waving an envelope like it was on fire. The return address made my stomach drop. Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I'd been dreading this moment for months, ever since the suburban development sprouted up like mushrooms after rain on what used to be the Johnson farm next door. The letter was everything I'd expected and worse. Notice of violation, stamped in red across the top, followed by a laundry list of complaints about my unkempt agricultural property that was supposedly diminishing neighborhood property values. They wanted me to mow my native grass fields, remove the unsightly old windmill, and modernize the appearance of my 100-year-old barn. The fine was $1,500, with additional penalties if I didn't comply within 30 days. $1,500 for letting my land look like, well, land. For maintaining the prairie grasses that had grown here for centuries before some developer decided this corner of Kansas needed another cookie-cutter subdivision. I'd inherited this 40-acre spread from my grandfather 5 years ago, and it had been in our family since the 1920s. The windmill had pumped water for 3 generations of cattle. The barn had sheltered livestock through countless storms. The fields had fed families and wildlife alike. But apparently none of that mattered to the HOA board, who saw my heritage as nothing more than an eyesore. Standing there in the afternoon heat, holding that ridiculous notice, I made a decision. If they wanted to play hardball about my property, I'd show them exactly what they were dealing with, starting with what was buried beneath that unsightly windmill. That evening, I pulled out the old photo albums and land records that Grandpa had left me. I'd been meaning to go through them properly for years, but life on a working farm doesn't leave much time for nostalgia. Now, facing the HOA's ultimatum, I needed to understand exactly what I was fighting for. The photographs told the story of a different world. Images from the 1920s showed my great-grandfather standing proudly beside the newly installed windmill, which had been state-of-the-art technology at the time. The barn, freshly painted and surrounded by carefully tended fields, housed dairy cattle that supplied milk to 3 neighboring towns. But it was the land records that really caught my attention. Deed transfers, mineral rights documents, and survey maps that showed property boundaries extending far beyond what I'd realized. According to these papers, my land included not just the 40 acres I'd been farming, but also the creek bed that now ran behind the subdivision and a significant portion of what was currently the HOA's community green space. More intriguing were the geological surveys from the 1940s, commissioned by my grandfather during the oil boom that swept through Kansas. The surveys indicated potential mineral deposits throughout the property, with particular interest noted around the windmill site. There were also references to archaeological significance and Native American artifacts, though the details were frustratingly vague. I spent hours cross-referencing the old surveys with modern satellite images, trying to piece together the full picture. The more I studied, the more convinced I became that the HOA had no idea what they were actually trying to force me to destroy. That windmill wasn't just a family heirloom. It was a landmark, sitting on top of something much more important. The next morning, I called my old college roommate, Marcus, who'd become an archaeologist specializing in Great Plains history. We'd kept in touch over the years, and I knew he'd be interested in what I'd found in Grandpa's records. "You're sitting on a potential gold mine of historical significance," Marcus said after I'd emailed him photos of the documents. "Those geological surveys mention artifact scatters that could date back 1,000 years. And if there really are mineral deposits under that windmill, you might have legal protections that supersede any HOA authority." Marcus agreed to drive down from Lawrence the following weekend to conduct a preliminary survey. In the meantime, he suggested I contact the State Historical Society and file a request for archaeological assessment. "Even if nothing comes of it," he explained, "having an official investigation pending will give you legal grounds to delay any HOA actions." I also called my lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Janet Torres, who'd helped me with the estate paperwork when I inherited the farm. She listened to my situation with growing interest, especially when I mentioned the discrepancies in the property boundaries. "HOAs can be bullies," Janet said, "but they're not above the law. If your property has historical significance, or if there are boundary disputes, we can tie them up in court for years. And if you're right about those mineral rights, they might not have any jurisdiction over your land at all." By the end of the week, I had a team assembling. an archaeologist, a lawyer, and a growing stack of evidence that my messy fields were anything but ordinary. The HOA had picked the wrong farmer to mess with. Marcus arrived on Saturday morning with a truck full of equipment and 2 graduate students eager for field experience. I'd marked off the area around the windmill with orange flags, creating a grid system that would allow for systematic excavation. The first few hours were routine, measuring, photographing, and carefully removing the top layer of soil. But around noon, one of the students called out excitedly. She'd uncovered what appeared to be a piece of worked stone, clearly shaped by human hands rather than natural erosion. "This is definitely Native American," Marcus confirmed, examining the artifact under a magnifying glass. "Looks like part of a grinding stone, probably used for processing seeds or grain. Based on the style and workmanship, I'd estimate it's at least 600 years old, possibly much older." As the afternoon progressed, more artifacts emerged: pottery shards, flint tools, and what appeared to be the remains of a fire pit. Each discovery was carefully documented and photographed, building a case for the historical significance of the site. But the real surprise came when we started excavating closer to the windmill's foundation. About 3 feet down, Marcus's trowel struck something that definitely wasn't stone or pottery. It was metal, and it was big. "We need to be very careful here," Marcus warned as we worked to expose more of the object. This could be anything from an old plow blade to a piece of farm equipment, but given the depth and the context, it might be something much more significant. By evening, we'd exposed enough of the metal object to see that it was cylindrical and appeared to be some kind of container. Whatever was buried under my windmill, it had been put there deliberately, and it had been there for a very long time. Sunday morning brought the breakthrough we'd been hoping for. Working carefully with brushes and small tools, we finally exposed the complete object. A large metal cylinder, about 3 feet long and 18 inches in diameter, sealed at both ends with what appeared to be lead solder. "This is incredible," Marcus whispered, running his hands along the surface. "The metalwork suggests late 19th or early 20th century construction. Someone went to a lot of trouble to preserve whatever's inside this thing." The cylinder bore no markings or inscriptions that we could see, but the craftsmanship was clearly professional. This wasn't some farmer's makeshift storage container. It was purpose-built for long-term preservation of whatever lay inside. We spent the rest of the day carefully excavating around the cylinder, documenting its position, and looking for any clues about who might have buried it and when. The soil layers suggested it had been placed sometime in the early 1900s, which aligned with when my great-grandfather had installed the windmill. "The timing can't be coincidental," I told Marcus, as we photographed the site from every angle. "Great-grandfather must have known about this when he chose the windmill location. Maybe he even buried it himself." The question was whether to open the cylinder immediately or wait for proper laboratory conditions. Marcus was torn between scientific caution and natural curiosity. As a compromise, we decided to transport the entire cylinder to the university, where it could be opened under controlled conditions with proper documentation. But first, I had a phone call to make. The HOA board was meeting Tuesday evening to discuss my violation, and I wanted to make sure they understood exactly what they were dealing with. This wasn't just about property rights anymore. It was about preserving a piece of history that had been hidden under my windmill for over a century. Tuesday evening found me sitting in the sterile conference room of the Meadowbrook Estates Community Center, facing 5 HOA board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. I'd brought a folder full of photographs and documents, along with a written statement from Marcus confirming the archaeological significance of my property. Board President Karen Mitchell, a real estate agent who'd moved to Kansas from California 3 years ago, called the meeting to order with barely concealed irritation. "Mr. Thompson, we're here to discuss your compliance with community standards, not to debate the historical value of old farm equipment." I laid out the photographs of the excavation site, watching their expressions change as they realized this wasn't going to be the simple intimidation session they'd planned. "This old farm equipment you want me to remove is actually sitting on top of a significant archaeological site. The State Historical Society has been notified, and the property is now under investigation." The board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Vice President Robert Chen, a retired engineer, leaned forward to examine the photos more closely. "These artifacts, they're genuine? Verified by Dr. Marcus Williams from the University of Kansas, I replied, sliding his official report across the table. The site contains Native American artifacts dating back at least 6 centuries, possibly longer. Any disturbance of the area could be a federal crime under the Archaeological Resources Protection Act. Karen's face had gone pale. But surely the windmill itself isn't protected. It's just an old piece of farm machinery. I smiled and pulled out my ace in the hole, the metal cylinder photographs. Actually, we've discovered that the windmill was deliberately positioned to mark the location of something much more significant. This sealed container was buried beneath it over a century ago, and we still don't know what's inside. The room fell silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning. Finally, Treasurer David Martinez spoke up. "What exactly are you saying, Mr. Thompson?" "I'm saying that before you fine me for maintaining my property's historical integrity, you might want to consider whether your subdivision was built on land that should never have been developed in the first place." The next morning, Janet Torres called with news that would change everything. She'd spent the night researching property records and had discovered something the HOA's lawyers had apparently missed during their due diligence. The mineral rights to your property were never transferred when the Johnson farm was sold to the developers, Janet explained. Your great-grandfather retained them in perpetuity, and they passed to you along with the surface rights. That means any subsurface discoveries on your land belong to you, regardless of what the HOA thinks about your farming practices. More importantly, Janet had found evidence that the creek running behind the subdivision was actually within my property boundaries, according to the original 1920s survey. The developers had apparently assumed the creek was a natural boundary and had never properly surveyed the land before building their community green space. If I'm reading these maps correctly, Janet continued, the HOA's playground and walking trail are built on your land. They're essentially trespassing, and they've been collecting dues from residents for maintaining facilities they don't actually own. The implications were staggering. Not only did I have grounds to fight the HOA's violations, but I potentially had a claim against them for unauthorized use of my property. The power dynamic had shifted completely in my favor. That afternoon, I drove to the university to meet with Marcus and observe the opening of the metal cylinder. Whatever was inside had been waiting over a century to be discovered, and I had a feeling it would provide the final piece of the puzzle that would settle my dispute with the HOA once and for all. The laboratory was sterile and bright, a stark contrast to the dusty excavation site where we'd found the cylinder. Marcus and his team had spent 2 days carefully cleaning the exterior and preparing for the delicate process of opening the sealed container without damaging whatever lay inside. Chapter 8. The Revelation. The cylinder opened with a soft hiss of escaping air, releasing the faint smell of old paper and metal. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas and protected by layers of wax paper, were documents that would rewrite the history of my family's land. The first item was a leather-bound journal belonging to my great-grandfather, detailing his negotiations with representatives of the Kaw Nation in the early 1900s. According to his careful handwriting, the windmill had been built not just to pump water, but to mark the location of a sacred burial ground that the tribe wanted protected in perpetuity. "This is extraordinary," Marcus breathed, carefully turning the journal's yellowed pages. "Your great-grandfather was essentially serving as a guardian for a Native American cemetery. The windmill was a marker, ensuring the site would never be forgotten or disturbed. But the journal was just the beginning. Beneath it were official documents, treaties, land grants, and correspondence with federal Indian agents that established the burial ground as protected territory under federal law. My great-grandfather had been more than just a farmer. He'd been a custodian of sacred land. The final item in the cylinder was a detailed map showing the extent of the burial ground, which stretched far beyond my property boundaries. According to the map, the HOA's subdivision had been built directly on top of dozens of unmarked graves. "This changes everything," I said, studying the map with growing amazement. "The entire development is sitting on a protected cemetery." Marcus nodded grimly. "Under federal law, this land should never have been developed. The fact that it was suggests either criminal negligence or deliberate cover-up during the permitting process." I thought about the HOA board members who'd sat in judgment of my messy fields, completely unaware that their manicured lawns and sidewalks were desecrating sacred ground. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. Chapter 9. The Federal Investigation. Within 48 hours of our discovery, federal agents from the Bureau of Indian Affairs were on site, along with representatives from the Kaw Nation and a team of forensic archaeologists. The quiet, rural road that led to my farm suddenly resembled a crime scene, with government vehicles and equipment trucks parked along the shoulder. Agent Sarah Blackhorse, a member of the Cherokee Nation who specialized in archaeological crimes, took charge of the investigation. She examined the documents from the cylinder with the reverence they deserved, understanding immediately the significance of what we'd uncovered. "Your great-grandfather was a remarkable man," she told me as we stood beside the windmill. "These documents show he spent years working with tribal leaders to ensure this site would be protected. The fact that he buried the evidence beneath a permanent marker shows incredible foresight." The investigation quickly expanded beyond my property to include the entire subdivision. Ground-penetrating radar revealed the outlines of numerous burial sites beneath the HOA's common areas, confirming what the century-old map had indicated. Residents of Meadowbrook Estates watched in shock as federal agents cordoned off their playground and walking trails. Property values, which the HOA had been so concerned about protecting, plummeted overnight as news of the discovery spread through local media. Karen Mitchell called me that afternoon, her voice shaking with barely controlled panic. "Mr. Thompson, we need to talk. The board is prepared to discuss a resolution to our misunderstanding." I almost laughed at the understatement. Misunderstanding was hardly the word for building a subdivision on top of a protected cemetery, but I agreed to meet with the board that evening, curious to see how they planned to handle the situation. The community center was nearly empty when I arrived, a stark contrast to the packed meetings where residents had previously complained about my farming practices. Chapter 10. Turning the Tables. The HOA board looked like they'd aged years in the past week. Karen Mitchell's usual confidence had been replaced by the haunted expression of someone facing potential federal charges. The other board members sat in uncomfortable silence, avoiding eye contact as I took my seat at the conference table. "Mr. Thompson," Karen began hesitantly, "we want to apologize for any inconvenience our previous actions may have caused. We clearly didn't understand the full situation regarding your property." I let the understatement hang in the air for a moment before responding. "The full situation is that your subdivision was built on a protected Native American cemetery, in direct violation of federal law. My messy fields were actually preserving sacred ground that your development has been desecrating for 5 years. Robert Chen cleared his throat nervously. "What we're hoping is that we can work together to find a solution that benefits everyone. Perhaps some kind of arrangement that would allow the community to remain while properly honoring the historical significance of the site." I pulled out the folder of legal documents that Janet had prepared. "According to my lawyer, there are several issues we need to address. First, your community green space and playground are built on my property, which means you've been trespassing for 5 years. Second, the federal investigation may result in criminal charges against the developers and anyone who knew about the burial ground during the planning process." The board members exchanged panicked glances. David Martinez spoke up with a trembling voice. "We had no idea about any burial ground. The developers assured us all permits were properly obtained." "That's between you and them," I replied. "But here's what I'm prepared to offer. I'll work with federal authorities and tribal representatives to develop a plan that might allow some of the existing homes to remain, provided the community agrees to certain conditions." I outlined my proposal. The HOA would formally acknowledge the sacred nature of the land, establish a memorial and educational center, and contribute to a fund for proper reburial and protection of the disturbed graves. In exchange, I would consider allowing some of the development to remain under federal oversight. "And the violations against my property?" I asked pointedly. Karen's voice was barely a whisper, completely withdrawn, of course. Chapter 11. The Reckoning. Over the following months, the story of Meadowbrook Estates became a cautionary tale about the importance of proper archaeological surveys before development. Federal investigators discovered that the original developers had been aware of potential burial sites, but had chosen to proceed without proper tribal consultation, hoping to avoid delays and additional costs. Several executives faced federal charges for violating the Archaeological Resources Protection Act and the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. The company was forced to pay millions in fines and restitution to the Kaw Nation, effectively bankrupting the firm and serving as a warning to other developers. For the residents of the subdivision, the revelation was devastating. Property values collapsed as the federal investigation made national news. Many homeowners found themselves underwater on mortgages for houses built on land that might eventually be returned to tribal control. But not everyone suffered. Working with tribal leaders and federal authorities, we developed a plan that balanced historical preservation with practical realities. Homes built away from the burial sites could remain, but with deed restrictions requiring ongoing maintenance of the memorial areas and annual contributions to the preservation fund. The HOA's common areas were completely transformed. The playground and walking trails were removed, replaced by a memorial garden and interpretive center that told the story of the Kaw people who had lived on this land for centuries. My windmill became the centerpiece of the memorial, finally receiving the recognition it deserved as a guardian of sacred ground. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that my unkempt fields, which the HOA had wanted to force me to mow, were actually native prairie grasses that had been growing here since long before European settlement. They became part of the memorial landscape, a living reminder of what the land had looked like before development. Chapter 12. A New Understanding. A year after the discovery, I stood beside the windmill watching a group of Kaw Nation children learn about their ancestors from tribal elders. The memorial garden had become a place of healing and education, visited by thousands of people who came to learn about the area's true history. The windmill still pumped water, just as it had for over a century, but now it also served as a symbol of the importance of preserving sacred places. A bronze plaque at its base told the story of my great-grandfather's partnership with tribal leaders and his commitment to protecting the burial ground. Many of the original Meadowbrook Estate's residents had moved away, unable to cope with living on land they now knew was a cemetery. But others had stayed, becoming advocates for historical preservation and forming genuine relationships with tribal members who visited the memorial regularly. Karen Mitchell was among those who left, selling her house at a significant loss and returning to California. But Robert Chen had remained, becoming the volunteer coordinator for the Memorial Center and working closely with tribal educators to develop school programs about local history. The legal battles had been exhausting and expensive, but they'd also been necessary. The federal investigation had led to stronger protections for archaeological sites across the region and new requirements for tribal consultation before any major development projects. My own life had changed dramatically. The story of the windmill and the buried cylinder had made me something of a local celebrity, with reporters and historians regularly visiting to learn about my great-grandfather's remarkable foresight. I'd been invited to speak at conferences about agricultural preservation and indigenous rights, topics I'd never imagined discussing before the HOA tried to fine me for my messy fields. Chapter 13. Legacy Protected. Today, 5 years after that first HOA violation notice, my farm operates much as it always has. I still grow corn and soybeans, still maintain the native grass fields that my ancestors preserved, and still pump water with the windmill that has become a symbol of resistance against thoughtless development. The Memorial Center hosts thousands of visitors each year, from school groups learning about local history to researchers studying the intersection of agriculture and indigenous rights. The Kaw Nation has established a cultural program on the site, teaching traditional farming methods and prairie restoration techniques that benefit both the memorial and my working farm. The financial settlement from the federal case allowed me to expand my conservation efforts, placing most of my acreage under permanent easement to ensure it will never be developed. The irony that the HOA's attempt to force me to modernize my property ultimately led to its permanent protection, as historical farmland isn't lost on anyone involved. My relationship with the remaining subdivision residents has evolved from hostility to mutual respect. They've learned to appreciate the value of agricultural heritage, and I've gained neighbors who understand that preservation sometimes requires accepting things that don't fit suburban aesthetic standards. The windmill still stands guard over the memorial, its blades turning in the Kansas wind just as they have for over a century. Children who visit often ask if it's haunted, and, in a way, I suppose it is. Haunted by the wisdom of my great-grandfather, who understood that some things are more important than appearances or property values. The metal cylinder that started it all sits in a place of honor at the Memorial Center. its contents displayed alongside artifacts from the burial ground and photographs of the excavation. Visitors often express amazement that such important history was hidden for so long beneath what appeared to be just another piece of old farm equipment. But that's the lesson I've learned from this entire experience. The most important things are often hidden in plain sight, protected by people who understand their value even when others see only obstacles to progress. My messy fields weren't messy at all. They were exactly what they were supposed to be. Thank you for listening to this story about standing up for what's right, even when it means fighting powerful interests. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me what part of the world you're listening from and whether you've ever had to defend something important that others didn't understand. If you enjoyed this tale of one farmer's battle against suburban sprawl and historical ignorance, please consider subscribing to the channel for more stories about the unexpected treasures hidden in rural America. Sometimes the best way to preserve the future is to protect the past.